We're going to have a great time tonight. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all here to listen to, as he suggested, the contest of ideas. I'm so appreciative that both of these men, Dr. Carl Goldberg and Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, have agreed to come here. And although they're both adamant about their positions and they disagree, we're going to experience probably some hard-hitting but respectful debate. And I believe this is what is so unique about America. The ability to come together, individuals who may have drastically different views, but are able to do it in an environment where we're not worried about the government coming down upon us, and being able to do it in an environment where there is respect for those positions, although there may not be agreement. So let's go ahead and get this started off right. Let me tell you about the rules that we have in place. Each side will be given 2 minutes for opening statements and closing arguments as well. They'll have 2 minutes to close. The questions, we have a number of questions that we're going to be asking them. Each side will have 2 minutes to address the question, to make their argument, and then they'll have additional 2 minutes for rebuttal. So each question that you're going to hear, they're going to have a total of 8 minutes to respond to. And this is the Lincoln Douglas style of debate, and the reason for it is very simple. We want to have not just sound bites going back and forth. We want to be able to get a little bit down and dirty, if you will, about these particular issues and how they're going to impact our culture and where we need to go as a country with respect to some of these ideas that we're going to be tossing back and forth. So Dr. Carl Goldberg, he holds a doctorate in history. He's studied Islam since 9/11, and he's given hundreds of talks on the subject for various groups and on the radio. Dr. Goldberg cites Islamic religious authorities who tell us that Islam is not merely a religion in the common understanding of the term, but also a totalitarian and imperialistic ideology. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Carl Goldberg. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is a devout Muslim. He is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy that was founded in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States. Dr. Jasser has recently appeared on Fox News, both with Megyn Kelly and Sean Hannity, to discuss Muslim radicalism and what it means for us here in America as well as around the world. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. We had a coin toss prior to getting started tonight, and Dr. Goldberg is elected to begin first with opening statements.
Could I ask, first of all, before you start the clock, is this working?
It's working.
Okay. Could you please turn off those lights? I mean, it's a terrible glare in our eyes here. We have lights for the auditorium, but not those flashing lights. Yeah, the Klieg lights, get rid of them. Can you turn them all the way down? Oh,
we don't want it to be too dark on stage.
That's fine. If you have any stage lights, that would be good too. But okay.
For purposes of footage, David, Buckley, are we okay on the cameras?
Turn those off, please.
Yeah, we want to get footage for this, and you guys are dark up there.
Take pictures.
Buckley, how's the footage from back there? Let's turn them up a little bit, just a tad, to see if we can compromise here.
Let there be light during my presentation. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm suggesting we turn them up just a tad so we can see these folks. Okay, Dr.
Very good. Shane, I want to thank you very much for stimulating a discussion on Islam, because this is the most important question facing us in the world today, and anything you can do to stimulate discussion is good. Now, you know, until a couple of days ago, I thought this was going to be showdown at high noon, but then I watched Dr. Jasser's interview with Megyn Kelly, where he attacked Obama and Kerry for saying that ISIS was not Islamic. Well, if Dr. Jasser is attacking them for saying that ISIS is not Islamic, it means that Dr. Jasser must feel that, well, ISIS is in some way Islamic, and we agree on that. And it seems to me that the rest of the evening is going to be spent just filling in the details. Now, the title of the debate you have here is Understanding Islam, a Threat or a Faith. Let me say that this is misleading. The title is misleading because it gives us only an either-or situation, and it excludes the third possibility, which is in fact I believe the correct one, that Islam is both a threat and a faith. This is what we need to keep in mind. It's not either or. And now faith is another term we need to kind of keep in mind. Faith is usually conceived of as personal. We're talking here about religion, not just faith. Now, Dr. Jasser advocates a liberty-minded, pluralistic understanding of Islam. That's great. I hope he will explain to us how he plans to introduce that, because it does not now exist. The reason for this debate is that so far people have been blaming radical Muslims, radical Islam for the problem. That takes attention away from Islam itself, and my contention is that the problem is Islam and not radical Islam, because if you ask the question, where does radical Islam come from? It comes from the same place that Islam comes from, that is the Quran and Muhammad. And lastly, we need to distinguish between Islam and Muslims. Islam is a body of doctrines that comes from the Quran and the sayings of Muhammad, whereas Muslims are people, and they may or may not follow the doctrines of the Quran and Muhammad. So please keep those two in mind. Thank you.
Dr. Jasser.
Thank you, Shane. I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening. Since time is short, I'll dive right into the subject matter. I think there's nothing more important than this issue in the 21st century. As a physician, every day I treat disease, and if I treat just symptoms, I will not only commit malpractice, I won't treat the condition correctly. So if we get the diagnosis wrong, we also get the treatment wrong, and we could ultimately drive the world and drive ourselves not only down the wrong path, but into a cataclysmic clash. And we're talking about a faith that has a constituency of a quarter of the world's population. So what is the difference between the faith and the threat, if you will? And I think I want you to look upon this as intersecting circles. Certainly the threat is, I call it a theopolitical threat, a threat that involves and dominates the laws of governments, that is what I would call Islamism or political Islam. And today we'll sort of navigate what that is and how we separate that. But I think if you look at every time in humanity, and especially as Americans, we realize, and especially in this audience, people who don't want government to tell them what they want or what they believe or what they should do, people who believe that the smaller governments are better. And I think the theocrats or the men, usually men in robes, we don't want them to tell us what our faith is. That's really the essential nature of America, which is that Christians created a Christian nation without the word Christian in our documents. So can a Muslim be Muslim and be Islamic while rejecting our leadership? I'll agree that we have a profound leadership problem, and actually most of the Islamic leadership around the world are theocrats or autocrats of some kind or other that are pushing a 13th century ideology. But the question is can I, as a Muslim, navigate a moral, compassionate belief of my faith and still adhere to what I would call Islam? And I would tell you, if the premise that Islam is simply totalitarian was true, I think the world would have perished a long time ago. This is not a faith of a small percent of the population. So ultimately, let's get the diagnosis right, and then we can talk about treatment. Because if you get the diagnosis wrong, and you alienate those Muslims who can take back the mantle of faith, which was why I argued that it is Islamic, but it's not my Islam. Islam is not monolithic any more, any less than Christianity is monolithic. So as we leave here today, if you believe that Islam is monolithic and there's only one, then you're going to disagree with me and agree with Carl. If you believe it's a diverse faith, then you will believe that ultimately we have to take sides within the house of Islam.
Dr. Goldberg, we'll begin with you. Can political Islam be separated from Islam? Is the distinction between political Islam and Islam important, and if so, why?
Okay, the distinction is crucial. It's more than important, and in fact, our civilization depends on getting the answer right. Is it Islamism or is it Islam? Political Islam, Islamism, there are different words for it. Yes, it's crucially important, and the reason is that if we consider that Islamism is the problem, we will have one set of policies designed to deal with it. If we consider that Islam is the problem, we'll have a totally different set of policies to deal with it. This is why it's so crucial. If we have the wrong policies, Dr. Jasser was mentioning getting the diagnosis right. Yes, we must get it right, and if we get it wrong, we're going to lose. So the problem with focusing on Islamism is that it looks at these radicals, which are essentially the tip of the iceberg. There's this whole section of hundreds of millions of Muslims in the middle, typified by the Muslim Brotherhood, which follow the same goals as the extremists, so to say, which is setting up a worldwide Islamic caliphate where Sharia law is imposed on the entire world. This is not only the tip of the iceberg. This includes all of the mosques, all of the standard Islamic laws and rules and ideology. It all comes from the same place. This is what we call the stealth jihad. In other words, they're pursuing jihad, which is the essentially the conquest of the world for Islam, but they're not necessarily attracting attention by cutting people's heads off. So where does political Islam come from? This is the crucial question. It comes from the same place that regular Islam comes from, that is from the Quran and Muhammad. There are loads of statements from the Quran and Muhammad which you have in front of you. We're not going to use them here, but I hope you take them home. You will look at them, and you will see that, in fact, all of the ideology that both Dr. Jasser and I oppose come from standard Islam. And it has been standard Islam for more than 1,000 years. It is taught and preached in every mosque. And so failure to focus on the doctrines and failure to focus on the Quran and on the statements of Muhammad is in fact aiding our enemies, because failure to focus on it will in fact prevent us from identifying our enemies.
Dr. Jasser.
Well, I think ultimately to talk about whether you can separate political Islam from Islam, let's understand what political Islam is. Political Islam as a movement of Islamic states is only 100 plus years old, from Sayyid Qutb and the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Egypt in the early 20th century. And from that has sprouted hundreds, if not thousands, of various movements that now occupy the laws of the lands of most of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation states that call themselves Islamic. So they're not technically, many of them, theocracies, but the laws, the construct of the state and the mixture of religion and infusing the laws of those lands are theocratic for all practical purposes. Islam is 1,430 plus years old. Christianity took 1,789 years until there was a document, a constitution with an establishment clause that rendered unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God what is God's. We can talk about what's in the Quran and what's not. Certainly the Prophet himself did not separate mosque and state, but this was 620 AD. There was no state in the world that separated religion and state. It took another 1,100 years until Christianity and Christendom figured that out. And why can't Muslims go through that same evolution? Now you'll hear that the Quran is black and white. The interpretations of many are black and white. The Quran script, we believe as Muslims, cannot be changed. But the adherence to the authenticity of script is no different than Orthodox Judaism that adheres to the Old Testament, to any faith that believes that the essence of its faith has to be maintained in its authentic nature. But the interpretation, bringing these things to modernity, whether scripture or passages are metaphorical versus being literal, this is the debate that Muslims, and I can tell you there are millions, and there are scholars, Abdullah Naim and Emory University, Muhammad al-Ashmawi, and others. You'll hear the likes of Carl say that, well, Zuhdi creates this Islam, it's his private Islam, as Pamela Geller and others have patronized my work. The issue is that there are scholars out there. They're not fueled by petrodollars. They're not fueled by large militaries that oppress and imprison their ideas. So ultimately, liberal movements can take hold, and this reform, this modernization of Islam can happen, I believe, no different than it did. And that separation is absolutely necessary between political Islam and the faith itself of pietistic Islam.
Dr. Goldberg, rebuttal?
Sure. The notion that political Islam is about 100 years old is simply historically false. As Dr. Jasser himself mentioned, there was unity of Islam and the state at the time of Muhammad, and Muhammad is, in fact, required to be the best example for all Muslims to follow. So the mere fact that it happened in the 7th century, that does not mean it stopped being valid in the 7th century. It is valid today. Islam is a theocratic system. It requires total unity of religion and state. Now, there may be some Muslims who don't like that. That's fine. There should be more of them. But the fact is that the doctrines require this unity, and any Muslim that says, we want to separate this, is in fact introducing heresy into Islam, and according to Islamic law is to be killed. Now, the notion that Christianity went through its evolution, and therefore Islam can go through this evolution, this is logically absurd. If you want to find out whether Islam can go through an evolution, you have to study Islam, not Christianity. The two have nothing to do with one another. There were reasons for the Christian Reformation, and we will talk about that in subsequent questions. But it has absolutely nothing to do with Islam. Look at the doctrines of Islam, and you will see that they do not permit evolution. In fact, it is strictly prohibited in Islam to introduce anything new. And in fact, we'll talk about that in subsequent questions also. So Islam cannot follow the same evolution that Christianity did. The two are totally unrelated. Now, Dr. Jasser was talking about his own Islam. That's fine. The problem is that it contradicts and is in opposition to the Islamic religious establishment and all of the Islamic religious traditions for the last 1,400 years. There's no problem with some Muslims not following this doctrine. No problem in our country, which is basically a Judeo-Christian country, with freedom. You can do that here. But you can't do that with Islam. In a Muslim country, you would be lucky to get out with your head if you tried it. Thank you.
Dr. Jasser, rebuttal?
I think it's important. It's interesting how Carl talks about Islam as if he's God. I talk about my Islam. I talk about the Islam that Muslim scholars, President Abdurrahman Wahid, who was the president of Indonesia, wrote a book called The Illusion of the Islamic State. I'd ask you to look at it. It was a book read by and distributed by his organization that had 20 million Muslim members. He talks about the fact that the only successful Islam, that Muslims need to have a state of Islam in their heart, but need to reject the Islamic State and all Islamic states. This is not an aberration. These are movements that have occurred. There are many Muslims. Muhammad al-Ashmawi rejected the Islamic law of Nasser in Egypt in the mid-1900s, and ultimately he said that as a jurist, his interpretation of Sharia is that it's a personal one between an individual and God, and that nowhere in the Quran does it tell Muslims how to set up government. It's God speaking to individual Muslims. Yes, there's a lot of hell and brimstone in the Quran, like the Old Testament, and it's not a very peaceful document. Muslims are not pacifists. There were battles that were happening then, but ultimately, how can we interpret it in light of Americanism, in light of freedom and liberty and personal faith? In Islam, one of the detriments, assets if you will, or one of the liabilities is that we have no central authority. The imam means teacher, no different than rabbi means teacher. So nobody can stand up and say, contrary to what Dr. Goldberg's doing, nobody can stand up and say what Islam is. Certainly the president of Turkey has tried. He says he knows there is no moderate Islam because there's one Islam. These are all Islamists whose oxygen for political survival revolves around creating the Islamic State, that rights don't come from God, they come from the cleric. These are also dictators who own petrodollars, who own monarchies that they can't give it up. So ultimately, the institution of Sharia law is the best way to control populations. And I would defy anybody to give me an example of where there's been a true free market of ideas in Muslim-majority countries where Islamism has proven to win out the hearts and minds. We've not had that yet.
Dr. Jasser, we're going to begin with you on this question. There's a lot of fear out there about the Islamic worldview. On September 11, 2001, 19 terrorists who avowed the Islamic worldview killed 3,000 Americans in the name of their religion. What do you say to Americans who believe that the doctrines of their faith condone this sort of behavior? Maybe another way of asking this is, what is the cause of the radicalization of Islam?
Well, I think that is the issue for us as Americans, is your interest in this is, you can dismiss what I'm talking about as being mythology, and obviously you have to if you're not a Muslim. But the question is does my mythology, as Jefferson talked about in his papers on religious freedom, does your God, when your God interferes in my God, that's when I draw the line. And this is the issue, is when Islam as a doctrine, as a global view, interferes in American security, American freedom, governance, and the spread of freedom around the world, then that should be something that we're concerned about. And as we see in ISIS and in all of the Islamic states, Saudi Arabian Wahhabism created the radicalization of ISIS and a lot of these groups. You get rid of one, another one will come up like a hydra. So how do you treat the disease? You treat the disease, you inoculate Muslims against radicalization, as the NYPD report on radicalization talked about, by stopping it at the first step, which is a personal identification with the secular nation state. And I learned, and I grew up in a family, as I talk about in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, all faith is personal. And I think if you can look and talk to Muslims about what makes them tick, what makes them identify with their nation state, there are many Muslims, especially those of us here for political reasons, that came here and knew we could practice our faith more freely in a nation state that separates church and state or mosque and state than in any country that would call itself Islamic. And that's why I joined the Navy. That's why I abandoned the concepts of jihad, the concept of ummah as nation state. There are some core tenets of Islam, I would agree, of normative Islam as is taught by many clerics that need reform. But that is not, when you say all Islam, you're telling a Muslim that my personal relationship with God is the problem. You're telling a Muslim that my perception of the Prophet Muhammad, who we believe was the messenger of God, is somehow tainted by an evil man. That will not work for reform. We do reform in every faith from a position of love to marginalize those that would take our faith and turn it into a supremacist worldview. And if we inoculate Muslims with these ideas of liberty, and that makes them get closer to their God, our God, then ultimately that'll prevent the jihadization, their pull of what I call Islamo-patriotism into Iraq, into ISIS and Syria, and all over the world, because that's the threat, is Islamo-patriotism.
Dr. Goldberg?
Sure. A few years ago, there was a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about how the children of secular parents, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, often become more religious than their parents. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. In the article, only the Muslim parents were worried that their children might become radicalized. Why is that? Well, the article didn't give the answer. Now we need to look at what the answer actually is. Saying that it's simply political Islam, that doesn't give us an answer. Radicalization begins with the Quran, because that's where all of these jihadist doctrines are. And so it's when these teenage children who are going through some sort of an identity crisis, they go back to the roots of their religion and they read the Quran. They have been told by their secular parents that the Quran is Allah's literal word, perfect, complete, immutable, and valid for all of eternity. Even if the parents have never read the Quran, they transmit this virus, this infection to their children that the Quran is Allah's literal word. Later on, when the children are looking for their identity, they go to the Quran and they find out what Allah really wants them to do. And then they become radicals. So it's this infection that gets transmitted from generation to generation. And it's the underlying fundamental premise of Islam is that the Quran is perfect. And it's God's complete and perfect and direct word. There was a recent example in Scotland where there were a couple of moderate Muslim parents were absolutely shocked when their daughter wrote back from Syria, because the daughter had gone to Syria to become a jihadist and become a martyr. And she said that she was going to bring her parents into paradise after she gets to paradise for being a martyr. Where did she get these ideas from moderate parents? Well, the moderate parents taught her to pray, and they taught her to revere the Quran. Even though they themselves didn't follow what was in the Quran, they taught her that, and she took it seriously. That is where radicalization comes from. It's when Muslims begin to take the Quran doctrine seriously and not reject them, as Dr. Jasser has. He's rejected several of these core tenets. That's great. But there are Muslims who don't reject that, who support those tenets, and that's where radicalism begins.
Dr. Jasser, rebuttal?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that it's just unfathomable that an individual can stand up. I don't know how many Muslims you've actually talked to, 5 maybe in your lifetime, to say that there are Muslims that are secular parents that just hand a book to a kid and that book makes them into radicals is utterly absurd. That the book has to be combined with, and what is sad to me is not that this is one individual with these beliefs, but he is leading you all into a dead end. It is a dead end because right now, there is a project out there. It's not the book. It is a global movement of an ideological movement led by the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamist groups, governments, fueled by billions of petrodollars, buying networks called Al Jazeera, spending $500 million to inoculate Americans that we are the problem, that we are bigots, and not to have the debate. And rather than spend time, all of us, talking about the problems of political correctness, the problems of a media that bends over backwards for Islamist collectivist movements, instead, we're trying to debate what Islam is as if we know. And the issue is that I think the reality is, what's your strategy? If your strategy is to ultimately convert a quarter of the world's population, fine, you really don't need me. But if the strategy is to create societies that are based in freedom and liberty, that separate mosque and state, that then give all faiths a free market of ideas to debate what is and what is not our scripture, and free markets, which we have economic interests in, that ultimately is something that I think is a valid strategy that we can approach. And if you look at radicalizations, I mean, it's sad to me that ultimately the reason why these secular kids end up with wanting redemption and get radicalized like the rapper that went and beheaded the journalist James Foley is because of the profound pathological secularism that's existing in England, in Europe, and because we're suppressing public displays of religion in America. What happens is then the Islamists portray the West as anti-religious, anti-God. It makes us as proud Muslims unable to say that this country, the West, gives us the laboratory to be truly Muslim. They use that against us. So actually, the very treatment you seek is actually shoved underground by belief that Islam is the problem versus faith being the solution.
Dr. Goldberg, the final word on this issue?
Sure. In my opening remarks, I mentioned that we have to separate the two concepts, Islam and Muslims. Islam is the body of doctrines based on the Quran and the traditions of Muhammad. That is what Islam is. And the fact that there are reform movements and many Muslims who don't follow these doctrines, hey, that's great, but that says nothing about Islam. It says something about the fact that many Muslims don't like those doctrines, don't like those core tenets, and I think that's wonderful. There should be more Muslims like that. However, the entire Muslim religious establishment always supports those core tenets from the Quran and from Muhammad. And so any reformists, any Muslims who want reform have to go up against the religious establishment, which has been essentially the same for over 1,000 years. They've used the same documents, the same Sharia law schools. Nothing has really changed in those, because they can't change, because the documents based on Muhammad and on the Quran don't change. Those are eternal. So please keep in mind that any Muslim movement towards reform has to go up against the Muslim religious establishment, which represents Islam. So there's a difference between Islam and the Muslim people who may or may not accept the doctrines. But the fact that Muslims don't accept the doctrines doesn't change the doctrines. The doctrines remain the same. This is what we have to remember. This is Islam, and those doctrines will always continue to produce Muslims who do take those core tenets seriously. And that's where the problem comes from.
Dr. Goldberg, we'll begin with you on this particular question. Article 6 of the Constitution requires that individuals working within the government, military, and otherwise take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. Can Muslims, from your perspective, be loyal Americans, loyal government servants, and military soldiers?
The question of loyalty is a very important one. First, let's look at the logic. Islam consists of the Quran, again, and Muhammad, and Sharia law. Sharia law is a totalitarian law. It is all-encompassing, and the reason is that it covers every aspect of life. You will hear from Muslim religious authorities and every Muslim website, they will refer to Islam as a complete way of life or a complete code of life. Others will call it a comprehensive ideology. Well, complete and comprehensive means total, and that is totalitarian. If Islam is then a totalitarian ideology, there is no room for any other set of values. And so there is no room for loyalty towards America and the American Constitution. A leader of the Council on American Islamic Relations said last year, if we are practicing Muslims, then we are above the law of the land. Well, that's a statement of disloyalty if there ever was one. But notice also, he distinguishes between practicing Muslims and non-practicing Muslims. And what he's saying that Islam, that's what's followed by practicing Muslims, there cannot be loyal. Now, there's a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal 3 years ago entitled "The Islamist Threat Inside Our Military." And the writer, who considers himself a devout Muslim, said that there's an irreconcilable conflict between allegiance to the United States with its secular constitution and fealty to the consciousness of an Islamist state that centers on the Quran as its constitution and the Ummah as its global citizenry. Well, those are two core tenets, and practicing Muslims must respect at least those two core tenets. The article goes on to say that the basic conflict between the declaration of faith and testimony that there is no God except Allah and Muhammad is the messenger, on the one hand, and declaration and pledge of allegiance of the United States is irreconcilable. So that's a statement, and this statement was by the highest Islamic religious authority in the United States. By the way, that article was written by Dr. Jasser.
Dr. Jasser.
Well, he quoted the article correctly in that I was talking about Islamism, and I think this is actually one of the most important questions and is really one of the reasons we formed our organization. I believe Islam as a faith that I believe is God's faith is between God and an individual, and I'm not doing all this work for Islam. I'm doing it, number one, for national security issues, and two, for my kids, ultimately, because this conflict between national identity and their faith is something that we need to reconcile as Muslims. And I'm not telling you that it has been reconciled. And I think he talked, interestingly, and the refrain he keeps repeating for you, which I find interesting, is that he continues to talk about the Islamic establishment. Well, who are we as Americans? We fought against the establishment of religion, the theocrats of England. Why can't Muslims have that same vision? And if it existed, it wouldn't be a vision. If it was, if reform had happened, it wouldn't need reform. So ultimately, there's a lot of duplicity there in the conversation. And the issues of security clearances, I've been trying to get the government to pay attention to. When I testified to Congress, this was one of the issues. If you look at Nasser Abdo, Nidal Hassan, so many others that have taken the oath of loyalty, not as citizens. Let's make a clear distinction. I'm not talking about citizens. What Egypt did to the Muslim Brotherhood is abhorrent in the last few months. It is what creates the Muslim Brotherhood by punishing them, killing them in summary executions, pushing them underground. If you push mosques and other Muslims underground that are part of the Islamist ideology, you will fuel their fire and create a much larger movement, because you can't monitor and criticize with the sunlight, antiseptic of sunlight, ideas that are a threat to our state. But in the military and in government, we need to have a stronger security clearance mechanism, no different than we did in the Cold War against communist thought. This is a political threat where Muslims who may sign up as loyal Muslims actually end up having loyalty to the jihad, to a sense of patriotism, to a global Muslim community or ummah, which we need to have filters for, and it's not hard to do. It can be done, but it is, as I said in that article in Wall Street Journal, it is ground zero of this war of ideas, is loyalty to America as a nation state versus the Islamist movement globally. But faithful Muslims are going to be the ones to help you with that. You alienate faithful Muslims, and you'll never be able to figure out how to do security clearances for Muslims.
Dr. Goldberg, rebuttal.
Thank you. Actually, Dr. Jasser just took the words out of my mouth, essentially. We're talking about practicing Muslims. Those are the Muslims who accept those core tenets of Islam that Dr. Jasser rejects. These are the Muslims who are causing the problem. They are the practicing Muslims. Yes, how do you take action against them? Well, loyalty oaths and various kinds of verifications. That's certainly one way to do it. I would absolutely agree with that. We must take action against Muslims who may be suspected of believing in those core doctrines of Islam. That's why I say that Islam itself is the problem, and we need to find out those Muslims who, in fact, follow those core tenets. Dr. Jasser says that Islam needs reform. Well, and I don't think anybody doubts that. The question is, when you say Islam needs reform, it means that there are certain things wrong with Islam right now, which means there are certain things in the Quran and Muhammad that you disagree with, that you find that need to be changed. Because Islam, as I mentioned, is the Quran and Muhammad. If you think that something needs to be reformed, kindly tell us what needs to be reformed and how you plan to do that. Because we need somehow to protect ourselves. And right now the threat is coming from Islam itself, which produces many Muslims, some of them go into the military, who follow the core doctrines of Islam. That's what it's all about. No matter what you try to do in the way of reform, you are going against the religious establishment, and that means all of the imams, all of the mosques, the Muslim community organizations that are associated with the mosque, all of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the probably 1,000 Muslim Brotherhood front organizations, which are insinuating themselves into American life. This is what you have to go up against when you talk about reform in Islam. I don't see much point in talking to non-Muslims here about how Islam needs to be reformed. This needs to be said to Muslims. If you can do that, if you can get Muslims to listen to you and say that, well, you know, maybe my religion is not all that perfect after all. They've been taught that it's perfect. Remember that the Quran is God's perfect word. So if you're going to change that, it means that, well, you have to reject that premise, that God's word is not perfect after all. I don't think you're going to find any member of the Islamic religious establishment to agree with that. They must preach the Quran and Muhammad as the perfect word. There is no way around that. And so as far as reform goes, I wish you best of luck, but I wouldn't bet my money on it.
Dr. Jasser, the final word on this issue.
Yeah, I think he's wishing me luck. So what is he saying? That we should build a wall around America and hope that Islamists will somehow disappear? They do have a global vision of imperialism, and our population is shrinking and theirs is increasing. So that is not a strategy. And ultimately, unless you'd like to end up in nuclear war with Pakistan and other Islamic republics, that is not a strategy. I will tell you that it's interesting, if you listen to Carl, he is telling you that ideas, I talk about reform of the House of Islam, reform of Muslims. I don't tell you reform of Islam is an idea. It's not contrary to CARE that believes that somehow there's Islamophobia. How can you be afraid? I'm afraid of certain ideas. I'm socialist phobia. I'm communist phobic. I mean, so Islamophobia is a legitimate fear if you're talking about Islamism. But yet, ideas we determined by having free speech in our First Amendment, we determined contrary to most Islamic governments and contrary to the history of theocratic Europe before the Revolution and Reformation, is that religious ideas don't have rights. We have a right to blaspheme, to be heretics, to say whatever we want, because ultimately we determined as a society and as human rights that this was the way to prevent the track down a slippery slope of government interfering and declaring who's apostates and who's not, and thus doing that through blasphemy laws. And it's interesting, if you listen to Carl, he's basically saying, when he talks about Islam as an entity which he knows, he's saying that he knows what it is and it has rights and it exists as some type of definable entity. And all I would tell you is that, yes, Muslims need reform. Yes, we have a leadership problem with Islamists running the show, and most Muslims who are just like the silent Germans are sitting around not doing anything against the threat of Islamism. But to say that that's Islam is no different than saying somehow the German nationalism now has forever been something evil, that ultimately there is a way to come out of reform in a positive way. And lastly, in my last few seconds here, I want every one of you to think about me as a Muslim. He's saying that I abandoned my faith, that somehow I'm not a true Muslim. Do you really think that the tenets of the Quran, the details of the theology, really made me into the Muslim that I am when I started to learn what the Quran said? Or was it my family, my consciousness, my morality, my character, and other aspects that then took me to the book so that I could interpret those things based as an American? That's how reform works. It's not the other way around.
Dr. Jasser, and with that, we're going to start with you. I want to follow up with some of the things that you just said. As a Muslim, I assume that you believe in Sharia and follow Sharia. If that's the case, talking about the worldview in general and those that have adopted the worldview, how can you or those that have adopted that worldview stay true to our man-made laws in the West? Are the extremists living a life inconsistent with what the Quran teaches?
Well, I think this question of Sharia is very important, because if you're an Islamist which includes, as I've said, many of the Islamic governments. The Muslim Brotherhood had a population that voted for them of 25 to 30% of the Egyptian population. Add to that 10% of the Salafis, who are even more extreme than the Islamists, and you're talking about 40% of Egypt. They still were taken down by a majority of Egyptians. The instrument of Islamism is Sharia. And Sharia to a Muslim means God's law. So again, we have to be careful. Nuances are important. If we say all Sharia is bad, we're saying to a Muslim, God's law is bad. I use Sharia in my life to figure out prayer rules, dietary rules, holiday restrictions, travel restrictions that I impose on myself. I consider myself to be Orthodox. How could I be Orthodox? Well, I have a set of rules that I believe are my faith, and I adhere to them in a compulsive way. That's the definition of orthodoxy. Now, if you ask the religious establishment of Islam, I'm a heretic, I'm a liberal, I'm a far lefty, they would consider me to be. But so were the founding fathers of our country. And ultimately, canonic law was marginalized in Europe. Talmudic law is part of a Orthodox Jew's life, but most every Jew I know doesn't want that being told to them by government. So there's a way to believe in Sharia and separate out the personal pietistic laws of Sharia. And then we as Muslims need to be, and you all need to hold us accountable. You need to start screaming from the rooftops, where are the Muslims that condemn Sharia in government, that condemn the cutting of hands, that condemn the treatment of women as second and third class citizens, the laws that say a woman gets half a vote of a man, which I believe does say that in the Quran, but I believe can be relegated to history, just like polygamy is permitted in the Quran, but you take that in the context of the 7th century. In the 21st century, I've never met a Muslim married to more than one wife. So ultimately, there is a way to adhere to modernity and not say that that wasn't God's word, but put a circle around it and say that that doesn't apply anymore to the 21st century. And that's the difference between Sharia that is compatible with today and Sharia that we need to say is incompatible with modernity.
Dr. Goldberg.
Sure. Dr. Jasser, you said that, for example, cutting off of hands and the treatment of women is only worth half of a man, that this needs to be reformed and this needs to be looked at in its historical context. After all, these come straight from the Quran. Let me say that, and this is not my opinion, but any kind of making the Quran historically contingent means that you're saying that those verses of the Quran are no longer valid as a guide for behavior today. That is considered apostasy by the Islamic religious establishment, and it is punishable by death according to Sharia law. In fact, there was a case in Gaza a few years ago where a Muslim Quran teacher was teaching precisely this doctrine to his students, that these nasty verses of the Quran belong in the 7th century and that we need to modernize that. His students threw him out of the second-story window and killed him because it is heresy, and heresy is punishable by death according to Sharia law. Sharia law is not something that you, at least according to the Islamic religious establishment, not something that you can pick and choose. There is no salad bar Islam, according to doctrines. You either accept all of it or you are considered an apostate. Now, I'm not making that up. I'm not giving you my opinions here. These are the doctrines as stated in the Quran and by Muhammad and by the Islamic religious leaders. They say that. And so there is no room for picking and choosing. Now, in this country, it's a free country. You can practically pick and choose as you please, but that's not according to Islam. That's according to the freedom that our Judeo-Christian country has conferred on everybody to do. In Islam, there's only one determination of right and wrong, and that is Allah. Allah determines what is right and wrong, and nobody else. And extremists, well, who's an extremist? Extremism means deviation from the norm. In our society, you are extremist if you cut off someone's head. In Saudi Arabia, the norm is to cut off people's heads, and that's not considered extreme in Saudi Arabia. A couple of years ago, I spoke with the Imam in Tempe. He called Dr. Jasser an extremist because Dr. Jasser deviates from the Islamic norm.
Dr. Jasser, rebuttal?
Well, I think many libertarians and others that may be in the audience would take the label of extremism as being a badge of honor. And I think this is the issue, is that when you're compared to theocrats, they will consider us to be extremists. And I think there's three concepts here that are important, is that if we take Carl Goldberg's opinion about Islam, right? I mean, he's making, it sounds like I'm not debating Carl, I'm debating Ayatollah Khomeini, right? I mean, this is what Ayatollah Khomeini would say. This is what bin Laden, this is what the head of Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabi leaders would say about our Islam and the interpretations. So there's three areas that are important to understand when you're talking about Sharia. Number one is ijtihad. Ijtihad is the Islamic concept of interpreting law in light of modern day through a critical lens. That was happening. It was a dynamic entity for hundreds of years in Islam until the doors of ijtihad closed around 1300. So if Islam could not reform, then ultimately that would have not existed. There were 4,000 schools of Sharia thought up until that time. Now there's 4, which are all basically 70–80% of it's all the same. And this is why he's able to peddle this idea that there's only one Islam, because in the last 600 years, the Ottomans and others made sure there's really only been few versions of Islam, all of which most of us don't want. So ultimately, if you look at what is to defeat the concept and reform is ijtihad. Now, is that going to happen in my lifetime? No, that's not. Sharia and its modernization to schools of thought that would accept what I'm talking about, that's not going to happen. And strategically, I'm not advising that you all try to get new schools of Islam built and all that to do this. The first step, that'll happen in 100, 200 years. What will happen in my lifetime is the separation of mosque and state. Ultimately, Muslims will reject theocracy. And that can be done through, the second concept is reason. That societies based in reason Muslims want to live in a society based in reason far more than one based in scriptural exegesis, where the clerics tell you this is what it is, it's black and white, you can't think on your own. There's no critical thinking. The biggest disease in the Arab world is the lack of critical thinking, actually, much more than Islamists, which are hijacking this absence. And the ulama, or the scholars, exploit that concept.
Dr. Goldberg, final rebuttal.
Sure. I think to put this onto the Arab world is a mistake, because you have the same Islam, whether it's in Nigeria, or it's in Somalia, or it's in Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, which is not Arab, Iran, they're Shiites and certainly not Arabs, but they all follow the same playbook of the Quran and the traditions of Muhammad. It all comes out the same. Wherever they take political power, Sharia law looks the same. They cut off hands, they cut off heads, they put women into these burqas, subjugation of women. It all looks the same. Now, talk about Sharia law. Here's a manual of Sharia law. In fact, it's the most popular Sunni manual of Sharia law, because it's all in one volume, 1,400 pages of it. This manual was approved by the highest Islamic religious authorities in the mid-90s, the highest Islamic religious authorities of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and America. These are the people who determine what Islam is and what Islam isn't. It's not Ayatollah Goldberg. It's not my opinion. These are the ideas and the opinions of the highest Islamic religious authorities. And if Dr. Jasser would like to go against them, that's fine. But that doesn't change Islam. It just changes Dr. Jasser and the people who follow him. We hope that there will be lots of Muslims who will reject the core tenets of Islam, the most core one being the unity of mosque and state. We hope there will be lots of them. There are many Muslims who don't go to mosque even now. Great, there should be more. But that doesn't change the doctrines of Islam. It just changes the behavior of many Muslims. Let us hope that there will be more such Muslims. But that does not change the doctrines, and I need to say that over and over again, because Islam is the doctrines, as in the Quran and Muhammad. And anybody who wants to change those, these movements want to change that, they will have to go up against the Islamic religious establishment, against the imams in their mosque, against the Sharia boards, against the American, the Muslim Jurist Association. All of these highest Islamic religious authorities, they are the ones who determine what Islam is. It's not a crisis of leadership. This is the same doctrines that have been in Islam for 1,400 years.
Well, Dr. Goldberg just talked a little bit about the highest Islamic authority, and that of Muhammad. So much of what it is that we're talking about tonight is rooted in the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. Do you believe Muhammad was an honorable man of character, and ultimately does it matter?
Thank you. My opinion about Muhammad is absolutely irrelevant. Nobody cares what my opinion about Muhammad is, nor should they. However, it is of crucial importance what Muslims think about Muhammad. The Quran says in many, many places, it's a command, you must obey Allah and His Messenger. In other words, Muhammad is put on a pedestal of authority over people equal to God. Furthermore, the Quran says that Muhammad is the most excellent and beautiful example for everybody to follow, which means that if you are a Muslim, you must follow Muhammad's example, and all of these thousands of traditions, the hadiths that have been determined to be authentic by the Muslim religious establishment, those are considered sacred, and all Muslims are obligated to follow them and to believe them. Now, that doesn't mean that they all do, but again, there's a deviation and a separation between what Muslims do and what they're supposed to do. We need to keep that in mind. So, about Muhammad, I would certainly, if you're interested, recommend this book here that just came out, Islam According to Muhammad, Not Your Neighbor, by Dr. Stephen Kirby. There's also a very good book on Muhammad by Robert Spencer, called The Truth About Muhammad. Muhammad did lots of things, and if you want to decide whether he's an honorable man, you should see some of the things that he did. Well, he had 3 poets murdered because they were writing verses that he didn't like. He also had more than 600 Jewish prisoners of war had their heads cut off, and he apparently participated in that, and his 13-year-old wife was sitting there watching. So he did these things. He did many things. He said, for example, here, I have been ordered to fight with the people until they say none has the right to be worshipped but Allah. This is a declaration of war, and others, many other declarations like it, and a declaration of war only on the basis of belief. He also said that you Muslims will fight with the Jews until some of them hide behind stones. The stones will betray them, saying, "Oh, Abdullah, there's a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him." This is a call to genocide against the Jews, and it is part and parcel of the Hamas Charter, has been since 1988. And Hamas is a Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. They all accept this. Okay, I guess we're out of time, but there are many other statements by Muhammad. You have a sheet in front of you with a whole bunch of those statements. Please take it home and read it, and you'll see whether Muhammad is honorable or not.
While we're on the topics of books, Dr. Jasser, I believe you've written a book as well called The Battle for the Soul of Islam. It's for sale tonight as well. Dr. Jasser, go ahead.
Thank you. You know, I think this topic, as a Muslim, but also strategically for all of you and as Americans, is extremely important because, and I've debated Robert Spencer. You can see the video from the Horowitz Freedom Center where we talked about some of this, but not at too much focus. And I would tell you, you know, our country, our world can't even get right whether a genocidal dictator like Assad, with all the video and journalists, whether he used chemical weapons or not, we can't even get that right. And now I'm not deluded into thinking I'm going to convince all of you what actually was the intent of the Prophet Muhammad in a war with Banu Qurayza or others in 620 AD. I mean, I'm not going to do that. But all I can tell you is that look in your history books and find for me any faith that retained its name, retained its source and its origins and its scripture while demonizing its founder and its messenger. That will not work. And ultimately the example or the example of the Prophet Muhammad, while there may be things that we believe that we would do differently today, the question I ask my kids is not what the Prophet did in 620 AD, because he mixed. He was the head of a military, he was the head of state, and the messenger of God. But what would he do today if he knew that a country as vibrant and as successful as America existed? Would we still have an Islamic state if the Prophet Muhammad was alive today? That's the question. But I do believe, now the hadith, the saying of the Prophet Muhammad that he mentioned about kill a Jew behind every stone, I and millions of Muslims believe that that is not even the words of Muhammad. Many of us believe that a lot of what's considered to be the sayings of the Prophet wasn't even written down 70 to 100 years after the Prophet died, and is probably one of the primary tools of radicalization, of demonizing what actually Islam is. The Wahhabi reformists actually went back and I believe took some of the worst sayings of the Prophet that were thought to be his sayings and fabricated them and spread them now to the tune of $90 billion, as Jim Woolsey has talked about. And that has become what many consider to be normative Islam, which I don't believe in my family we ever felt that any of these so-called evil things that were done. Yes, the Prophet led wars, but just as the Catholic Church, the Jewish tradition, and others can believe in just war, what the Quran talks about being a just war in chapter 5 or chapter 9 does not mean that that's a war for all in perpetuity on beyond that.
Dr. Goldberg, rebuttal?
Sure. It's all very nice to ask, what would Muhammad do today? The trouble is there's no way of answering that. All we know is what Muhammad did then and what Muslims believe Muhammad did. That's in all of these hadiths, and you can say, well, they were forged, they came 100 years later, and it's all true, and there's no actual evidence, contemporary evidence, that any of this stuff is true, including the Quran. There's no contemporary evidence that Muhammad even existed. The fact is that that's not what's important. What's important is that millions and hundreds of millions of people believe it. And they believe that these hadiths, these statements of Muhammad, they believe that these are true and sacred and need to be followed today and not limited to the 7th century. Since there's just a few seconds here, let me give you a couple of other things that Muhammad said. And these are all considered to be sacred by the entire Islamic religious establishment. For example, Muhammad said, Allah commanded me to do away with the musical instruments. And part of Sharia law is there's practically no music permitted in Islam. Muhammad said, because Allah afflicted Eve, all of the women of this world menstruate and are stupid. This is an attitude that the Prophet had. The Prophet said, a man will not be asked as to why he beat his wife. Muhammad said, O women, give alms, as I have seen that the majority of the dwellers of hell were you. I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you. Is not the evidence of 2 women equal to the witness of 1 man? That's from the Quran. This is the deficiency in her intelligence. Isn't it true that a woman can neither pray nor fast during her menses? This is the deficiency in her religion. And then we also need to note that according to Islamic sources, Muhammad at the age of 51 married a 6-year-old girl. He had sexual intercourse with her when she was 9. He waited 3 years when she was 9 and he was 54. This is part of the example of Muhammad that Muslims are supposed to follow. And the consequence of this is that there is an enormous amount of child marriage in the Muslim countries, especially places like Afghanistan and Yemen and elsewhere, and wherever the governments try to establish a minimum age for marriage, they are opposed by the Islamic religious establishment because of this example of Muhammad.
Dr. Jasser, rebuttal?
There's no doubt that misogyny is a major problem, and I've talked about the fact that reform movements against political Islam will be led by mostly the feminist movements, by women's movements around the world. But ultimately, to demonize the Prophet Muhammad not only belies history. The Prophet's wife was Khadija, who was not only older than him, but was a businesswoman who fought in wars with him. And ultimately, if you talk to Muslim women in our families, I would defy you to find any that are modern, that understand their faith and would ascribe to any of the nonsense that is being peddled as being part of Islam. Now, ultimately, I'm not saying that there aren't many women that believe in these things and that are oppressed by men, as we see even here locally with honor killings and honor abuse that's happened with Noor al-Maliki and others that have been killed by misogynistic men that do so in the name of Islam. But to reform these ideas, you do it from a position of love within the faith. And we have examples of his tradition. The Prophet, the Quran is full of corrections where the Prophet, we believe, was a man who had errors and had corrective instructions from God. And yet, even with that, we believe, while he was complicated, he was a man of morals, a man of trust and integrity. And ultimately, this is the vehicle for, I believe, the modernization. Because if you demonize the messenger, you then invalidate the authenticity of the script that we believe is God, and thus all of Islam unravels, and you basically are telling Muslims not to believe in their own faith. So Even though we don't believe in the deification of Islam, it's been termed by Orientalist literature in the West as Mohammedanism, and the reason Muslims don't call it that is because we believe the Prophet Muhammad was a man who had no deification, and we believed in God, the God of Abraham. And this is one of the reasons there are differences between Islam and Christianity, as the position of Muhammad is very different for Muslims than Jesus' position is for Christianity. But it's very similar to that of Judaism, of the position of Abraham or the position of Moses. So ultimately, these are important aspects. If you're going to talk and help reformers, you'll do that through empowering moderate interpretations of the Prophet's history, not by imparting upon that example for Muslim kids a storyline that makes it into evil.
Dr. Jasser, we're going to begin with you on this one. We spent about the last 45 minutes talking about some of the problems. I think it's important to talk about some of the solutions. Is reform possible? And if so, what would that look like? And as you answer that question, I'd ask you to consider two things. What defines what is Islam and not Islam? And second, what is jihad and what happens to jihad in reform?
These questions are very important. And, is reform possible? I obviously believe it is, or I wouldn't be doing all of this work. If you look at Egypt, you had 10 million Muslims, mostly Muslims, come to the streets and to reject the Muslim Brotherhood. They were not nominal Muslims. They were Muslims who believed that they didn't want government to tell them what it was, what their faith was. Jihad is going to be a core part of that. And the reason is if you believe in an Islamic state, that state then has with it a loyalty to Islamic law. And thus, a war based upon when that state declares war on another state, those wars then become obligatory for Muslims, and that's where jihad is not this apologetic personal jihad, but it actually becomes a state-sanctioned war. And that's why Muslims, moderate Muslims, I believe, the true reformers, will reject all of the doctrine of jihad. Because you can't, as I mentioned before in the security issue, you can't be loyal to a state like America and still believe that a legitimate caliph can call for jihad. That's just a contradiction. No different than if the Pope would call for a war, can you be the President of the United States? You can't. We ask that question of our leaders all the time. And this is an important question to ask. And for Muslims, I think that's an important part. We can reform these ideas. And the reason why is, please tell me where in the Quran it tells you about clerical leadership, about the role of clerics in setting up government. There is nothing. There are some passages that imams use to empower, to say that to enjoin what is good and to forbid what is evil. There are other passages that they use, but nothing about how to set up our governments. If the state was such a big part of the central nucleus of Islam, are you telling me in the hundreds of pages of the script, God wouldn't have spent any time telling us how to set up government? So reform is possible. Jihad is possible to relegate into history, no different than any of these other concepts can be relegated. Thank you.
Dr. Goldberg.
Yes, you asked what happens to jihad in reform. Seems to me the real question is what happens to Islam in reform. There was an American writer, 60, 70 years ago, Mike Quinn, who once quipped that you can straighten out a corkscrew, but you don't have a corkscrew anymore. And so you can straighten out and reform Islam, but it won't be Islam anymore. Islam, as I mentioned, and I mentioned it because the Islamic religious authorities say this, not because I say it, that Islam is the Quran and it is the statements of Muhammad. That is what Islam is, and if you're going to reform that, you're going to take out pieces of the Quran and you're going to take out pieces of Muhammad's statements. Dr. Jasser says that, well, they weren't really written by Muhammad. Well, you can say that, except that the entire Islamic religious establishment for more than 1,000 years disagrees with Dr. Jasser on that. Okay, you can get Muslims who will push reform, but that means pushing it against this more than 1,000-year tradition of Sharia law and the Muslim religious establishment. Islam prohibits reform very clearly. So if you're going to reform it, you're going to have to go against the basic doctrines of Islam. Muhammad himself said, every innovation is a heresy, and every heresy is in the fire of hell. So no innovation. That's considered a major sin in Islam. Muhammad said, whoever denies a verse of the Quran it is permissible to strike his neck. In other words, to slice his head off. And the Quran, verse 285, forbids accepting part of the Quran and rejecting other parts of the Quran. As I mentioned before, there is no salad bar Islam where you can pick and choose those parts of Sharia law and those parts of the Quran that you like or that you don't like. And then relegate parts of the Quran to history. Actually, the Quran was delivered to Muhammad or preached by Muhammad over a period of 23 years in response to various events and conditions over those 20 years. All the verses of the Quran could be said to be historically dependent, but then you have nothing left if you look at it only as historically conditioned. The Quran is considered by all Muslims to be eternal. And it's not historically conditioned. As I mentioned, anybody who says it is historically conditioned will get his head cut off if the Islamic religious establishment has the power to do it.
Dr. Jasser, rebuttal?
Yeah, I think this is in some ways getting down to the core of the debate here, which is if a patient has a cancer, you want to treat the cancer, are you going to help that patient by telling him his entire being is cancerous? Or do you actually work with the patient to treat the cancer to get him back to, or her back to health and goodness? And ultimately, he has admitted that Islam would cease to exist if we believed his version of it. And I think what is amazing is, look back, this isn't my first rodeo as far as debates is concerned. I've been debating Muslims on this since even before 9/11 and talking about the threat of political Islam. And when actually the debates I have with Islamists is not that different. It's very similar. They say that I don't have the degree in Sharia. They say that my understanding is bad, that political Islam is democratic, and that ultimately, if left without Western influence, it will become this utopian democracy, no different than the West, just a different version of it. And they give you all these apologetics and basically try to marginalize our thought, no different than the Church of England and theocrats tried to marginalize Jeffersonian Democrats that came to form America, and only could do so after very bloody wars in Europe to marginalize theocrats. So yes, there is a lot of violence that Islamists perpetrate because that's the only way they can get their ideas to sink in. Left to a debate between Muslims who are non-Islamists and Muslims who are Islamists, the non-Islamists, the anti-Islamists win almost every time, because human nature, especially for Muslims, is to reject theocracy, that we have a very personal relationship with God. And ultimately, this is what the important thing is so who do you believe as you leave? You believe a Russian expert who doesn't understand Arabic is telling you what Islam is based on his own little textual understanding?
Yes,
or do you believe a
absolutely.
Muslim who's been debating within the Muslim community that's trying to give you solutions for a strategic approach, where if you follow the black and white approach to Islam, you'll be led into a dead end? And you can moan as much as you want, but you're headed towards a dead end of a global conflict between the West and Islam, which will not help your children, which will end up bringing us into nuclear conflict, that there are non-military, the only way to do this is in a non-military way. So you can marginalize people like me, or you can engage us to help you treat the cancer within our House of Islam.
Dr. Goldberg, final rebuttal on this issue.
Yes, Dr. Jasser questioned my qualifications because I'm not a Muslim, and he played up his own qualifications because he is a Muslim. Let me repeat again that I have been giving here not my opinion about Islam, but what the Islamic religious authorities say. They have the qualifications to tell us what Islam is or what Islam isn't. They are the only ones who have those qualifications. They've spent their entire lives studying Islam. My job is to simply show you what they say about Islam. The Islamic religious authorities consider Dr. Jasser to be totally without qualifications to speak about Islam. They have said that. They have said that in public, and Dr. Jasser has even admitted that. They don't consider him to be qualified to speak about Islam. That's not my saying, that's their saying. So people can consider it as they please whether you want to have reform. Dr. Jasser says he wants reform. He wants to talk about Islam. The fact is, he disagrees with the entire Islamic religious establishment, whose profession it is to know about Islam and to be qualified to talk about Islam. Look, the head of ISIS, Baghdadi, he has a PhD in Sharia law from an Islamic university. Do you think he knows more than Dr. Jasser about what Islam is? Well, I think so. It's not a question of how much I know. I'm not talking about it. I'm saying that these Muslim religious authorities, they have the qualifications because they spent their whole lives studying it. Khomeini is another one. All of the Muslim religious establishment, they are the scholars. They are the ones whose opinion we have to turn to find out what Islam is. Now, if Dr. Jasser doesn't like that opinion, that's his right not to like it, and in this country he has a right to organize a reform movement. But he has to organize this reform movement against all of the Islamic religious establishment. On Dr. Jasser's website, and I suggest that you go to it, there's a menu bar, and one of the tabs is Islamic reform. Please go to that and see what Dr. Jasser offers as a way of Islamic reform. You will find on that screen absolutely nothing. It says, this site under construction. It's been under construction for more than 10 years. Dr. Jasser has no program for reform. It's fine to say, let's separate mosque from state. Let's see how you do that.
Dr. Goldberg, if you conclude that Islam is a religion, are you advocating its abolition? In light of the First Amendment, if you in fact conclude that it is a religion, how is it that you see this issue being resolved in the context of the First Amendment? That is, how does America solve the problem with Islam while remaining true to the free exercise of religion, our First Amendment? Can this be solved?
This is a very good question. It's a very, very serious problem, and in my opinion, now I can give you my opinion here as opposed to the other things that I have said, which are not my opinion, but the statements of the Islamic religious authorities. In my opinion, we have to deal with Islam not as a religion, but to recognize its true nature. And here we turn back to the Islamic religious authorities who tell us what Islam's true nature is. Here's a statement by the leading Islamic religious authority in the world today, who has hundreds of millions of followers, Yusuf Qaradawi. He said, Islam is not a religion in the common distorted meaning of the word, confining its scope only to the private life of man. Dr. Jasser speaks of a personal faith. Well, the Muslim religious authorities say that Islam is not a religion of personal faith only. It is, in addition to that, a complete way of life. Other Islamic scholars call it a complete code of life, like in law code, that's Sharia Law, like in the manual over here. It covers every aspect of life, they say, every aspect of life from birth to death, all aspects of society and human relations. Another Muslim website says, quote, in sharp contrast to Christianity, Judaism, and other religions, Islam is not merely a religion, rather Islam is a unique and comprehensive ideology. So, we see that Islam is a totalitarian, because it's complete and comprehensive, it's a totalitarian ideology. In addition to being totalitarian, it is also imperialistic, because its goal is to take over the entire world and impose Sharia law on that. This comes from statements by Muhammad and statements in the Quran. Here's one by Muhammad. I have been ordered to fight with the people till they say none has the right to be worshipped but Allah. This is, again, not confined to the 7th century. It is something that is supposed to be eternally valid, and it is sacred. That's the statement of Islamic imperialism. From the Quran it says, make war on them until idolatry shall cease and God's religion shall reign supreme. Again, this is not confined to a battle in the 7th century. The Quran is a guide to Muslims' behavior for all of eternity. This is the imperialist element of it. Abu al-Maududi, one of the greatest Muslim writers, said, Islam wishes to destroy all states and governments anywhere on the face of the earth which are opposed to its ideology and program of Islam. Can this problem be solved? Only by treating Islam as an ideology and not just a religion. It's a subversive ideology, it's a revolutionary ideology that wants to replace our form of government with an Islamic form of government.
Dr. Jasser.
Shane, I mean, I think if I understood your question was about American law and the Constitution, and yet we continue to get diatribes about what Islam is. And, you know, the bottom line is that if we're talking about the American Constitution, and, you know, listen, it may be a good chuckle and a cheer for all of you to laugh at the fact that we don't have anything on our reform box, on our website, and, you know, we get it. My work is attacked by billion-dollar industries from the OIC, so that's one part of the triangle. The other part of the triangle is the far left that believes that Muslims are victims, could never be terrorists, that ultimately my work is a waste of time because CARE has it right, and thus most of the left actually ignores our work. The far right believes that Muslims are a security threat, so ultimately I'm somehow either lying to you or deceiving you. So please tell me where we're supposed to get traction to have all these tabs filled in for you. Reform is discussed in my book. It's discussed in almost every piece I've written. You look at all of what we've written, it talks about how to do reform. The Muslims that are part of our Muslim Liberty Project is part of the strategy. Dr. Goldberg has yet to utter one sentence to you of what a solution would be for all of you other than to leave here and go take some Prozac and figure out how to go into hospice. Because that's really the only solution. So ultimately, the point is that if you allow America to abandon its constitutional principles and start turning into Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Burma or other countries that I've been to that treat their Muslim minorities in a way that radicalizes them and creates bigger problems, that A, is not going to work, and B, is going to do exactly what bin Laden, the Wahhabis, and others want America to turn into. Because once America turns into the totalitarian dictatorship that prevents free markets of ideas, then no longer will Muslims want to embody the ideas of Jefferson and reform, and we'll all of a sudden be stuck truly with tabs of reform that are empty, and will no longer look to have visions of true leaders actually have a vision for the future. They don't just give you problems without solutions. And I think this is the issue. Do you have a vision as Americans of how we can use our principles to maintain our integrity as Americans in our Constitution? Or do you abandon that vision in exchange for security, which leaves you with neither freedom nor security, as one of our founding fathers said?
Dr. Goldberg, rebuttal.
Sure, there are some people who are very reluctant to consider that Islam is the problem because they think that there's no solution. If you have Islam as the problem, then you somehow have to fight 1.5 billion Muslims. Well, this doesn't make any sense at all. Nazism was a big problem for us, but we didn't have to kill 80 million Germans. We were able to defeat Nazism. We were able to defeat Japanese imperialism without killing all the Japanese. And we are able to defeat Islam without killing 1.5 billion Muslims. There are solutions. The solutions can be talked about on many fronts, but the solutions, I'll tell you, make no sense at all if you don't think that there's a problem. The problem, if you think the problem is not Islam, I can give you all kinds of solutions for Islam being a problem, but they make no sense to you. Let me give you just some of them, because many of the people here are convinced that Islam, in fact, is the problem and not just Islamism. Just as a couple of examples of what can be done. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood would have to be outlawed. That would be the first step. No special privileges for Muslims, like prayer times in schools, special foods in school cafeterias, all this sort of thing. High school textbooks. There are chapters on Islam in all of our high school textbooks. These chapters are written by the Muslim propagandists, the Islamists, as Dr. Jasser would call them. We need to reform those textbooks and tell the truth about Islam. We need to teach Islam again to all of our security services. Obama took Islam out of our security services so that there's no more way for anybody in the FBI, the CIA, Department of Defense, even to talk about our Islamic enemies. We need to reintroduce that. Immigration. We need to stop Muslim immigration to this country because you're importing precisely this ideology.
No Sharia law.
Importing this ideology. But we cannot do that only merely on the basis of religion. We have to recognize that Islam is also an ideology. And on that basis, we can begin to take action against Muslim immigration. We need to treat Islam like we treated communism 70 or 80 years ago. Sharia financing needs to be prohibited because part of Sharia financing sends money to Muslim charities, 1/8 of which must go to supplying funds to the jihadists who are our enemies. There are many other partial solutions here, so to say there's no solution is nonsense, and it's logically absurd to reject Islam being the problem because you don't understand the solutions. Let's investigate Islam first to see if it's a problem, and if it is, let's look for solutions afterwards. Thank you.
Dr. Jasser, final rebuttal.
You know, wow, if this is what's happening to the conservative movement, I'm horrified. I truly am horrified to hear somebody talking about outlawing Muslim immigration, to hear the outlawing of, to use the example of the Germans and the Japanese. Let's use that example. We nuked Japan. We defeated Germany in a major military conflict with tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands dead. So if you declare that Islam is going to have the same solution, you truly want to have a military conflict against 56 Muslim majority countries like we did with Japan and Germany? That's what, and now we can't even have the stomach to stay in Iraq like we should have? And ISIS has taken over, and Assad has fueled the radicalization because we've lost the intestinal fortitude to stay in a country that our sons and daughters fought to free. And now we're talking about declaring war against all these countries, and ultimately, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. I mean, there are many aspects to what Carl's talking about that I agree with. Sharia financing is a huge problem, and Muslims can help you fix that. But if you decide that Islam is the problem, we're not going to be able to help you fix that, because you're going to actually defy the very principles that when America was founded, the Baptists and the Methodists and the others decided that the word Christian would not be in our documents because they didn't want the others to be outlawed from society. And even with our founding documents, there were many counties and states in the South and elsewhere that for a while did certain things in the name of religion that were un-American. And ultimately, we evolved out of that into understanding what our principles were, going through a civil rights movement that began to get closer to the founding principles of our own Constitution. And being Muslim is not something we wear on our forehead. This is an ideology. And do we really believe, if you're a conservative and you detest socialism as much as I do, that you would defeat socialism by burying them and imprisoning socialists? Is that what we think? Is that how we won the Cold War? The Cold War is a better example. McCarthy might have been right about the threat of communism, but outlawing the Communist Party would have fueled the communist movement in America rather than being able to observe them and shed the light of day upon them and debate them in the marketplace of ideas. That's not the America my family came to, and I certainly will tell you that I will fight till my last breath to give conservatives a reminder of what our conservative movement is about.
Dr. Jasser, we'll begin with you here, talking about solutions. Please lay out your strategy, and including your plans to protect America from radical Islamists and also the byproducts of Islamic governments of the OIC of 56 nations. What do those solutions look like? And as you address this, would you address both short-term, that is 1 to 4 years, as well as long-term plans, 20 to 50 years? What do these things look like from your perspective?
Well, let's take some of the politics out of the solution, and you know, obviously there's differences in different commander-in-chiefs in the way they approach this, but I will tell you, I've been critical of both the Bush administration's approach and the Obama administration. Clearly, at least the Bush administration had a freedom agenda, had a vision of what would happen, but unfortunately, both parties have been looking at the Muslim world, however you want to call that, in a very binary way, that we have a choice between either Arab dictators and monarchs or Islamist governance, as we see in Iran or the Taliban or elsewhere. And ultimately, we've created these frenemies that are spreading ideas that are threats to our survival, and yet they may be the lesser of two evils. And that ultimately brings me to what I think the solution should be. Short term is a military solution for ISIS and radical groups, is through Homeland Security, beefing up our screening for political Islamists, the threat of ideologies that are counter to American freedom and constitutionalism and our citizenship oath. That can be domestically done and abroad, that we should no longer, through political correctness, be nice to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in these countries that have a vision of the world very different than ours. And that we should, as McCain and others have talked about, that we should have a UN that is truly based in democracies and reject the others out of the UN and talk about a League of Democracies. NATO should have been flying the operations in the past few days over Syria and Iraq, not Gulf monarchies that are truly just trying to contain a pit bull that they created. And ultimately, this is why we need to have a third pathway. The short term is a military solution for radical Islam, terrorist groups that are military target. Long term is a vision for what I would call a liberty doctrine through public-private partnerships. At our website, we talk about the Muslim Liberty Project. That's a youth project for getting Muslims into understanding what American nationalism is, what the Establishment Clause is, and how as Muslims to embrace that and bring those ideas into Muslim-majority countries. The American Islamic Leadership Coalition is a coalition of number of Muslim leaders that are anti-Islamist. Over 20 groups that exist are not figments of my imagination. I would ask you to look at those and learn about them from our website. And then use that to push these ideas on the ground. Iran had the Green Revolution. Egypt had its Revolution 2.0. The Europeans and France had many revolutions until it ultimately found democracy. And this, I think, we can either be on the right side of history or keep our heads in the sand and hope somehow by prayer that it'll work out.
Dr. Jasser, speaking of your website, would you outline the domain name, your website?
Oh, AIF Democracy, American Islamic Forum, AIFdemocracy.org.
And Dr. Goldberg, do you have a website as well?
No, I don't.
Okay. Dr. Goldberg, you're on.
Okay. Again, let me stress that we are talking about Islam as an ideology, not as a religion. We don't care how they pray. We don't care about the other rituals. We do care about the ideology, which says that they want to impose Sharia law on us and on the rest of the world. That is what we're talking about, and that is why we need to take these various solutions, find these solutions, take various measures against Islam as an ideology, like we took against communism, only even more so. So we need to keep that in mind. People tend to confuse that. Oh, you can't do this because Islam's a religion. We have religious freedom in this country. Well, yes, Islam is a religion, but in the words of the Islamic religious authorities, Islam is not just a religion. Islam is also a totalitarian ideology. They say that it covers all aspects of life from birth to death. Let's talk about the OIC for a moment, Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. It's the largest political bloc in the world, in the United Nations and in the world. There is no such equivalent for any other religion. It's, in a sense, an ersatz caliphate until the caliphate is restored. The OIC has 56 nations in it, plus the Palestine Authority for 57 Muslim-majority nations. This follows the entire pattern in the Quran, which divides the world into Muslims and non-Muslims. We don't do that. When we look out of the world, we see different countries and ethnic groups. When Muslims look out the world, if they're religious Muslims following the doctrines of Islam, they see Islam and non-Islam, they see Muslims and non-Muslims, and the OIC divides the world into Muslims and non-Muslims. When our president made his speech in June 2009 to the Muslim world, he acknowledged the legitimacy of dividing the world into Muslims and non-Muslims instead of into peoples and countries. The purpose of the OIC is to support the destruction of Israel and the Palestinianism. Also, they have what's called the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam. I suggest you Google it. This is sponsored and subscribed to by all Muslim nations. It makes all human rights subject to Sharia law. And the final point about the OIC, their biggest campaign is to suppress and to criminalize all criticism of Islam. It's an extremely dangerous organization, and we need to combat it.
Dr. Jasser, rebuttal.
Well, you know, I think ultimately I'm still not hearing much of a solution. And you know, we understand what the problems are, but if we agree that the solution is not military, then what do we do? If the solution is military, then obviously I think in the short term there are military threats, but those are not, you know, I don't believe in de-radicalization. I don't think that works. The Saudis tried it, and you know, you can't de-radicalize somebody who believes in a supremacist doctrine. So how do you counter-radicalize? I think that's ultimately, globally, we as Muslims need a counter-radicalization movement, and that is to counter the ideas of Islamism and those intersecting circles between Islamism and liberty. Right now, the intersection is not that significant, and it doesn't exist at all, but Islam is in the middle. There are Muslims that believe in liberty, there are Muslims that believe in Islamism. If you want to pull them away from Islamism, where this debate is happening, we need to have a vision of not necessarily understanding Islam, which I think is up to Muslims, but ultimately advancing liberty. Forget Muslims. What about China? 1 billion people who don't believe in your concepts of liberty. What about Russia, which we defeated the Soviets, but still is a failing society, as corrupt as it was the day we still have Cold War 2.0 happening. So forget the problem with Islam. We have a malaise in America. American ideals are on the wane globally. And 75% of the world lives in societies that are not free, that on the freedom scale are under autocracy and oppressive societies. So you can say that a big portion of the world is failing due to Islamism, but you put China and Russia in there, those aren't failing because of Islamism, they're failing from a lack of liberty, from a lack of freedom of ideas to debate, and because of autocracy and kleptocrats and other aspects of society that have prevented a free market of ideas. So take those same solutions that we're trying to apply to Russia, that we'd want to apply to China as free markets try to bring good ideas, and do the same thing in Muslim majority countries, but also work with and partner with Muslim reformers that, especially in the women's organizations, exist, that are independent and are rejecting the clerical establishment.
Dr. Goldberg, as you outline your rebuttal here, would you address, are there viable solutions short-term and long-term?
Well, I'd like to deal with that also, but Dr. Jasser is advising that we forget Islam and talk about China and Russia. Let me tell you why we cannot forget Islam. In fact, you don't need to be reminded of that. Not a day goes by but that we don't hear about violent religious bigotry, violent anti-Semitism, persecution of Christians, execution of homosexuals, subjugation of women, and the most gruesome, sadistic cruelty, all coming out of the Muslim world. They're not coming out of China and Russia, despite the fact that China and Russia don't have systems that we like. They're not as democratic as we like, but there's nothing like what is coming out of the Muslim world. That is why we are here tonight, to talk about Islam and not China and Russia. Talk about solutions, I mentioned some of them, but as I mentioned before, you cannot understand any solutions to the problem of Islam unless you admit that there is a problem of Islam. And there are some people in this room who don't want to admit that Islam is the problem. I've already shown you, in the words of the Islamic religious authorities, that Islam is a totalitarian and imperialist ideology. We see what Islam, the Islamic countries, are producing in terms of massive human suffering, all in the name of Islam and committed by religious Muslims, quoting the Quran and quoting Muhammad. This is why we are here, to talk about Islam and not talk about Russia and China. We have to talk about Islam. Radical Islam is not the only problem. There's this entire hundreds of millions of Muslims who support the basic goals of Al-Qaeda and of ISIS. And the goal is to establish an Islamic caliphate worldwide and impose Sharia law on the entire world. This is the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the Islamic Republic of Iran. By the way, you ought to read the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It states very plainly that their armed forces are not only for defense of the country, but for spreading Islam to the rest of the world, and that is what they define as jihad, and they quote a verse from the Quran to do that. It's exactly the same jihad that the Sunni Muslims have. It's the spreading of Islam to the entire world in any way possible, by force if necessary, not by force if possible. And so the Muslim Brotherhood is spreading its Islamic doctrines and its influence and its strength in our country by burrowing into all of our political institutions in order to affect policymaking in the United States. This is what the Muslim Brotherhood does, and it and its thousands of front organizations have exactly the same goals as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Thank you.
Dr. Goldberg, this is the final question. Our president on one day says we have no strategy, and on the next day he's engaging in airstrikes. What should our foreign policy be with respect to these OIC nations, And what about in regards to domestic and foreign Islamist threats?
Our policy towards the OIC. I mentioned that the OIC already is the largest political bloc in the world. It is based on Islam and not on other kinds of politics. So Islam is inherently political, and that is the OIC. They want to destroy Israel, they want to promote their version of human rights, and they want to criminalize criticism of Islam. What should we do? Well, we should certainly insist on freedom of religion in the Muslim countries. We can push that. We must defend the freedom to criticize Islam, freedom of speech. We must have that. If we ever lose the freedom to criticize Islam, we're finished. 58% of American Muslims want criticism of Islam not to be protected by the First Amendment. 58% of American Muslims. Well, all right, 42% don't agree with that, but 58% essentially want to get rid of First Amendment protections for criticism of Islam. 45% of American Muslims want to criminalize criticism of Islam. We must fight against this, and of course, this whole idea of criminalizing criticism of Islam is led by the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. They are the ones pushing for this throughout the world. We should not undermine secular dictators. I know that sounds strange, but in fact, in the Islamic world, the alternative to secular or semi-secular dictators is not democracy. The alternative is Muslim Brotherhood and Islamism. And so we have to be very careful when we undermine secular dictators like we did in Egypt, got rid of our so-called ally Mubarak, and what did we get? We got the Muslim Brotherhood. We destroyed Gaddafi. In Libya, we now have anarchy led by the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist organizations. So we need to be very careful about toppling these secular dictators, even though we don't like them. We should not be giving foreign aid to these members of the OIC any more than is in our own definite interest to do that. There should be no easy entry into the United States or visas for their citizens, because they are representing these countries which are in fact our enemies. Certainly no nuclear weapons for Iran. That's the big one. That's the game changer. Absolutely, we must forbid that by military means if necessary. Religious profiling, surveillance, yes, it must be reintroduced, remembering that Islam is not just a religion, but it is also an ideology. So it really is ideological profiling.
Dr. Jasser.
Yeah, I think this is very important. And, you know, many have said that the next election will look at the character of the conservative movement as far as what is our foreign policy and how we'll approach. Are we going to retract into more isolationism, or as they prefer to be called, non-interventionism, or are we going to actually believe that we advance the same ideals abroad that we have and believe in for our own citizens? And I think this dichotomy, this hypocrisy that we've had, I understand, and I talk about in my book, there's a chapter called Changing the Paradigm, in which I talk about the shift in policy. And you know, many now, it's almost become pejorative. The neoconservative movement was actually a positive movement after the wall fell and the Soviet Union fell. Ultimately, we shifted and no longer using these dictators as the enemy of our enemy and fueling their own autocracy and military dictatorship. We said, you know, Israel would be more secure, America would be more secure if democracies existed in the Middle East. Now, we thought that that could be done simply like turning on a light switch. It wasn't presented in a way of transformation. So how do you do this transformation? Propping up secular dictators is not only what got America a bad name, it doesn't work. It implies that somehow secular dictators can keep a pressure cooker under control. And what happens is they're cooking the stew that eventually, as we saw in Egypt, that we saw in Syria, is going to open and explode. Because what happens is the way these dictators operate, Mubarak may have called himself secular, but he showed the protocols of Elders of Zion every year in Ramadan, daily. He would put in Sharia Law. Al-Azhar University, which propagates a lot of the Islamist doctrine that Carl's talking about, that we want to reform, was put into place by these dictators as a tool to radicalize their population so that true moderates that were truly secular would never threaten them. Saudi Arabia, the royal family is not very religious, but they came up with this contract with the Wahhabis to control the judiciary and their educational system, to control their society so that they could turn now and say to the West, look, if we let go of the society, they would turn into radicals. And sure enough, that's what we see in Saudi Arabia, we see in Syria and elsewhere. So ultimately, this paradigm of only two choices needs to change. Societies may get sicker first, but ultimately the long path, as we saw in Europe and the creation of America, is one much better than the short term, which is hypocritical to our own beliefs, and second, is going to only radicalize them. The absence of America created the jihadist magnet of Syria that we know today.
Dr. Goldberg, rebuttal.
Sure. The world is in such a state that we don't really have a lot of choices. In the Islamic world, the choices are either semi-secular dictators or Islamism. There is no third alternative that is viable. We saw that a little bit in Egypt after Mubarak was overthrown. We thought this was going to be the Arab Spring. We thought that the democratic forces in Egypt were going to win out, but they were absolutely trounced by the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is true all over. Our whole policy towards the Islamic world, beginning after 9/11, where we invaded Afghanistan, we invaded Iraq, and the idea was that if we just get rid of the dictators, the Taliban in one case, and Saddam Hussein in the other case, then with a little effort, we can convert those societies into some sort of democracies. Well, we know how that turned out. It didn't work, and the reason it didn't work is that the population is thoroughly Muslim, Islamic. They do not want democracy. Democracy is impossible because of the Islamic doctrines that we have already talked about in the Quran and Muhammad. It just doesn't work. And trying to convert them to a democracy is doomed from the start. And so we have to be realistic about this. It's nice to be idealistic. It's nice to engender hope. Yes, we have to foster democratic forces. And if they're truly democratic forces, yes, we should foster them. But let's not kid ourselves that the replacement for dictators in the Islamic world is not democracy. Not now, not in 50 years, in 100 years, who knows, but not in the immediate future. The immediate future has only Islamists who will take over because they are the ones who are supported by Islamic doctrines, and the population is basically Islamic. The population has much more in common with the Islamists than they do with us, because they are taught to hate non-Muslims, hate the infidel, because that is in fact what the Quran tells them to do. It's very unfortunate that we're in this situation, but that's the way it is and we need to deal with it. And the question about moderate Islam, I hope there's no time now, but I hope that we will get to that in a future question. That was one of the questions. We need to talk about moderate Islam and moderate Muslims. We need to understand that in order to understand why our policies have failed in the Muslim world.
Dr. Jasser.
Well, I think ultimately, as we look at solutions, we need to look at concepts no different than in the Cold War. If you read Natan Sharansky's book, he said he understood that he would be free from a Soviet prison when he heard President Reagan call the Soviets the evil empire. He didn't say that we needed to identify all Russians as evil, the Soviet Union as an evil empire. So when we look at the ideas that we want to defeat, the ones that I believe are doable, that you can have at the head of the spear of this thing, needs to be Muslims. If you want Muslims to be at the head of the spear, then the solution needs to be from within Islam. And we need presidents and politicians and academicians and think tanks to create public-private partnerships with the courage to say that the concept of the Islamic State will be defeated by Muslims and liberty-minded Western governments at their side. The concept of the Ummah is okay for Muslim communities, but not as a state. Caliphism should be defeated, and the president should be talking about that from the bully pulpit of the White House. And our government should not be afraid, our media should not be afraid to ask Muslims about Caliphism. Nihad Awad wrote a piece in Time magazine a few weeks ago that said that the caliphate is some type of idealized entity that you need to be qualified, and he gave all this apologetics. That should be something, we sent the response to Time magazine, they didn't publish it. So this is the issue, is media does not want to deal with true reformers and give us a seat at the table, that ultimately I can line up for you Muslims that are going to debate this issue. I certainly can't fill auditoriums with Muslims like the Islamists can, because we haven't been greased to the tune of billions and millions that Islamists have in the West. But ultimately, someday, we are going to wake up Muslims in America we have the only laboratory in the world in America here to do this work. Syrians, Egyptians, and others, because of ignorance, because of illiteracy and other aspects, certainly they're fueled more because they know they have to fix the problem. They see what happens when the Brotherhood or the Khomeinis take over government, so they're fueled to do it. But they don't have the tools in the laboratory because they get killed, as often happens in societies that are not free. So we have the laboratory here, but we aren't pushing and fueling Muslims enough to do this work because we're giving them a pass on the issue, or we're telling them that their entire faith is the problem, both of which are a dead end.
We're going to go right into closing arguments. Dr. Goldberg, you were right. One of the questions that we were hoping to get to was that of moderate Islam. What I'd like to do is extend closing arguments from 2 to 3 minutes. I hope that in some way will accommodate, I know, your desire to get into that particular issue. So we're going to start with closing arguments. Dr. Goldberg, you'll go first.
Okay. The reason we're here tonight, again, as I mentioned, is that there is a continual outpouring of human misery and sadism coming out of the Muslim world, and it's primarily only the Muslim world, in the name of Islam, quoting the documents of Islam, the texts of Islam, by people who claim to be religious Muslims. These doctrines are the same doctrines that are taught and preached in every mosque in the world, because they come out of the Quran and they come out of the sayings of Muhammad. What is the danger of not identifying Islam as the enemy? One of the leading experts in America on Islamic terrorism, a woman by the name of Claire Lopez, she recently wrote an article and she says, quote, "Pretending that authoritative Islamic law and scripture are not the doctrinal source of justification for Islamic jihad terrorism only serves to blind and neutralize our ability to confront the Sharia threat." In other words, if we do not recognize that Islam is the danger, we are unable to take measures to protect ourselves from the threat of Sharia, because Sharia is grounded in those very doctrines that are taught and preached in every mosque in the world. Let's remember the following. First of all, there are moderate Muslims. Unfortunately, there was supposed to be a question about moderate Islam. There wasn't, but let me just say here a statement by an official from the Council of American Islamic Relations. He ran for president of Egypt also. He says, quote, "I was the first to expose the notion of moderate Islam, which is used as a means to canonize a non-Islamic Islam. This so-called moderation means violation of the laws of Islam." Furthermore, the Prime Minister of Turkey, now President of Turkey, said, "These descriptions are very ugly. It is offensive and an insult to our religion. There is no moderate or immoderate Islam. Islam is Islam, and that's it." And the reason he said that is that Islam is defined as the Quran and Muhammad. That is what it is, and Islam is not changeable as such. Dr. Jasser would like very much to introduce reforms into Islam. That's great, but he's running up against all of Islamic law and all of Islamic religious establishment, which is against him. And that's the reason why he enjoys practically no following in the Muslim community, including his own mosque. And there was a very interesting article that Dr. Jasser wrote about how the imam of his mosque attacked him for appearing on Fox News to criticize Muslim organizations. Again, we need to distinguish Islam from Muslims. This is extremely important. Islam is what it is. There's doctrines. Muslims can behave the way they want to. Some are reformists, some are not, but no matter if they do not follow the doctrines of Islam, the doctrines remain the same. Islamic ideology is both totalitarian and imperialistic. Please think of Islam then not just as a religion, but as a totalitarian and imperialist ideology. We must recognize that Islam itself is the enemy, otherwise we will be unable to take protective measures against it. Thank you.
Dr. Jasser, final closing argument.
Thank you, and I appreciate all of your time and listening to this debate. I think it's, on the one hand, very essential. On the other hand, I hope is the first step in a journey beyond a Muslim and a non-Muslim debating into the fact that this needs to happen between Muslims, because that's really where the solution is. And I think it is very deceptive for Carl to say that because I criticized the Imam for calling me a heretic and other aspects, the bottom line is there was no threats of violence. This was a debate. And I responded in the newspaper, and my family still goes to that mosque, and we have a number of members that are active in our organization, and he wouldn't be bringing me up in sermons if we weren't successful, if we weren't having an impact. We would be irrelevant to the imam at our mosque if we were not successful in what we were doing. So it's very deceptive to say that we have no following. If I didn't have any following, it wouldn't be the subject of the largest sermon at the mosque in Scottsdale. But that's facts, which are a difficult thing to deal with. The bottom line is, as Thomas Jefferson said, millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined, and imprisoned. Yet we have not advanced 1 inch towards uniformity as a community. What has been the effect of coercion in the Christian community? To make one half of the world fools and the other half hypocrites. To support roguery and error all over the earth. And that was in his notes to the state of Virginia. He then followed on and said, among the most inestimable of our blessings is that of liberty to worship our Creator in the way we think most agreeable to His will, a liberty deemed in other countries incompatible with good government, and yet proved by our experience to be its best support. And that was his reply to the Baptists in his address. So ultimately, Muslims, I believe, you don't need to believe me. Read what history is writing about the Syrian Revolution. It did not start as jihadists. There was hardly any Al-Qaeda other than in the prisons of Syria in March 2011 when the Syrian Revolution started. It was arm in arm in small cities across Syria with Christians and Muslims and Alawites and Shia and Druze who went to the streets, but week after week they were shot like ants by the government. And ultimately, the people who pejoratively, this president of ours, called pharmacists and doctors and sort of joked about their efficacy, revealed themselves to no longer be able to fight because they didn't have weapons, which is why I support our Second Amendment as much as I do. People who are unarmed cannot defeat a military dictatorship. So ultimately, what's left? A nuclear political winter that allows jihadism to come into Syria. And if you look, you think our technology is so great that we know how to pick out the headquarters of ISIS, but Assad couldn't do it for the last 20 months that existed in Raqqa, while he was barrel bombing neighborhoods in Syria? The dictator's manual says to bomb the moderates while you let the radicals thrive, so that's what the ideas infuse society to legitimize a military dictatorship. This two sides of the same coin needs to end, and it can only end when the leaders of the free world have a strategy, which we call a liberty doctrine, and is part of our solution, and is at least some hope at the end of the horizon, and isn't a dead end. Thank you.
Dr. Jasser and Dr. Goldberg, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here tonight. It was an absolute honor to have both of you here to engage in a bit of hard-hitting debate. These are serious issues, and of course that's why you have so many people here tonight. They're obviously concerned about where we're headed as a country as we deal with this particular issue. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me again?